That was Finlay O'Toole and the Mabinogian Band doing their jazzy rendition of the classic Irish folk ballad Update by Bayesian Priors. I'm Layman Pascal, and you're listening to All Night Meta Theory Roundup on the Integral Stage, the English-speaking world's premier source for pseudo-comprehensive psychospiritual, techno-social, and existential gibberish. Today in the studio, we're joined by Nexumorphic, aka Branden Singletary, author of the Metaforma text, to talk about his persistence, his projects, and his ongoing drive to perceive and encode the multidimensional, transdisciplinary, and layered emergent nature of reality. Hi, Branden.
Hello, hello. How we doing?
Do people ever call you Branden Singularity?
That has happened on numerous occasions, yes. And it makes sense because my general behavior is AI-like, apparently, to people. So, yep.
Okay, I think it's a cool term.
Yep.
What about Nexumorphic? How'd you pick that name up?
When I was about 15 years old, I was looking around for an online moniker, and I was like, okay, so let's see what I can whip up to here. And I just went through Latin and Greek. I just cobbled together a bunch of words, and I ended up with Nex and Morphic. I think Nex is Latin and Morphe is Greek. I fused those two together, and it became basically a death of form, or in the context that I made it, it was first shape of death, and it turned into death of form over time.
Nice. When I go to nexumorphic.com, I get this kind of ominous futuristic logo and a claim that you can help others defy their limits. Is that just a fun prompt, or is that really how you think about your life's work?
Yeah, that's kind of been my entire life, just constantly. It's self-focused. In the beginning of it, it was just generally in the sense of constantly trying to push further and go beyond what I was constantly doing. Every single project that I've ever done has been like, okay, I finish it, I make the whole thing, go through the whole process, and I basically immediately hate it, reject it, and go, okay, I'm not doing these things anymore. I'm going to go on and do something else. How do I improve upon this thing? And that's just been a constant iterative cycle. And I do think that I can, help people do that exact same thing.
There must have been a point at which you started to see that as a constant reiterative cycle. And before that point, it must have been sort of confusing or disheartening to finish the project to then feel aggressive or disappointed in it. You know, how did you come to notice that that was a pattern for you?
I think it mostly started when other people around me started actually saying that I just kind of do that. And they're like, oh, you know what? You keep doing this, you keep making something and you keep tossing it out the window. You do it so frequently. Like, is that normal? I'm like, you know what? Maybe it is. Maybe it is normal. And I just stuck with it. I just did it on purpose at that point.
Maybe it is normal. Okay, you got this thing, this Metaforma text, which I love the look of it because I grew up reading medieval and Renaissance alchemical notebooks with strange drawings and glyphs and cosmology, philosophy, metaphysical math, and psychospiritual suggestions all rolled into one, familiar and unfamiliar words, something like a left brain enumerated textbookery, but combined with poetic freeform vibes.
Yep.
Reading it, I thought this is like Spinoza doing psychedelics at a serious research facility on the moon. What attracted you to this to that style of expression?
For background, I was right before Metaforma was made. I was kind of in an in-between stage of from finishing a video project of trying to encapsulate all of my ideas into a visual form and show people and narrating and all of it, and creating a whole narrative out of it, a whole mythos, if you will. And I wanted to make an animation of what happens after the end of that video. But I realized I actually moved past animation and I can't bring myself to do it anymore. And in the background of all of that, I was working on a book at the time called Cosmic Perception, which was a more logical format of all of my ideas encapsulated in a single place. And I just thought, you know what, I'm just going to bring this book forward and see what comes of that. And that's when I started joining a bunch of philosophical communities. And just constantly engaging in discourse and getting feedback on all of my ideas as they come to me, and that has spurred a lot of philosophical growth in that sense. But the period in which I actually transitioned into the book and started trying to hammer in my ideas, that was a great time of turbulence, because I had to challenge all of my core assumptions and beliefs at the time. And the main turning point of it all was when I kept looping back and forth around Ludwig Wittgenstein's Tractatus, or at least his general work and his life in general. And when I finally sat down and focused on what he was doing and what he was saying, I was like, well, this guy is saying literally the exact same things that I'm saying right now. I should look deeper into him. And then I found the Tractatus, and I was like, this is the format. This is absolutely the format. I can do something with this. These bullet points, having it trying to make an entire world out of languages is exactly what I'm trying to do right now. I just went all in on symbols and all in on hyper abstract terminology, and even self-created terminology. And yeah, I tried to map out as much of the world as I can without getting lost in too much of the details.
Other than Ludwig, who's impressed you along the way? Who was doing something, big picture thinkers, whoever you're like, oh yeah, that's kind of cool. I need to absorb and do something like that.
There are a bunch of other ones. I think the main fascination before Ludwig was Heraclitus. His concept of becoming was particularly interesting to me. There was a little bit of Hegel in there sometime later. Around the time I found Wittgenstein, I was getting involved into a bunch of other ones too. Spinoza was one that I kept cycling back to, but I never really got into. I kind of looked at his biography and was like, okay, well, we're doing the same thing. I don't need to look into what he's doing. I get it. I already know what he's doing. Hegel was another one. He was fascinating to me, but I couldn't really get into it because it was generally obscure and kind of hard to get into. Another strong influence was Jung, especially his psychological archetypes and his cognitive functions, if you will. I might be missing a few other ones. I'm kind of getting them jumbled in together with more recent ones that I found, but yeah, those are definitely other ones. I'm sure more will come to me as the conversation passes.
All right. Just throw them out if they come
out.
Yeah. It can sometimes seem like there are theories of everything like all over the place, but they're actually historically and per capita pretty rare. And beyond that, there's very little market for them, especially when they're hyper idiosyncratic. Mm-hmm. What is it like to feel an urgency to attempt something like this? Why would a person want to do a condensed, super comprehensive mapping of the multidimensional patterning of reality?
I find that a lot of this stems from a very particular type of person that feels disconnected from where they are in the world, and they try to build a context because they've been lacking one for so long, and they don't understand why or how they've lacked one for so long when it would seemingly make sense to have one in the first place. So they go about making it because they're pretty much the only ones that can make it. It's an entirely personal, transformative project that they undertake, and by the end of it, it is indeed very transformative. I liken it to indeed an alchemical process of sorts whenever someone commits to creating something like this. Yeah.
Do you think that sense of needing to generate a context and an environment for yourself of this particular kind, is that a response to something about the way civilization is now, or do you think there's always been a subset of the population that's felt that drive and that need?
I would say, yeah, it is firstly on account of societal circumstances, because in modern civilizations, especially more recent times, I notice that if there is a lot of we'll say dissociation in society, and like in modern depictions of how things are right now, especially, and even centuries ago, there were times where I'd imagine that people were more and more isolated from great communities because of institutions and the like. It creates a sort of fission and separation from the collective motion into a culture, if you will. It's also a definite predisposition to thinking like this, to want holistic pictures of what is happening. And if something to the individual that wants a cohesive picture, if things are just kind of moving around in seemingly chaotic ways, they're going to want to bring it into some sense of order. Yeah.
When you look back at an artifact like, let's just say, the Metaforma, what are the parts of it that don't mean very much to you anymore? And what are the parts that are still really important and resonant with you?
I would say that, I guess I'll start with the things that I don't really resonate with anymore. Yeah, it would be the aspects that kind of show that it wasn't a fully formed thought. When I moved into the last third of the book, which kind of typifies society and how it kind of moves, it's there are some parts of it that weren't fully fleshed out, or at least not fully thought through. And now I just kind of look back and go, well, I could have said this instead. It probably would have been a little bit more apt. And it's like, I guess as an example, it would be how I divided society's functions, or things that kind of make up a society, into three categories, which kind of corresponds to the three domains that I kind of defined in the earlier sections of the book. But the one in particular would be the concept of the idol, which kind of typifies the body of the or the central body of a society, which can be typified as, yes, an individual, but also generally just a state, a governing state, if you will. And I think it was along the lines of a state weakens when when the idol is just, it kind of weakens. I didn't go into the details of how that could happen, and it kind of coincides with the concept of information just kind of degrading over time, and information, as it degrades, also degrades the informational density of the populace too, which means that they are implicitly kind of less vigorous as a result, and that just kind of makes everything dissolve. And if I said that, then that would have been great, but I didn't, so it's kind of like, whatever. I kind of reject that part, but the other two parts are okay, generally. And I guess another thing would be the beginning of it, because it was very haphazard now that I look at it. It's the geometric forms that I made were they could have been cleaner, but I also don't think it at the time I had any real way of making that happen. And generally, going into physics, I mean, I had to do that in order to move into the next few parts. But I also wouldn't have put that in there really. But as for the parts that I do keep around, it would be the second third of the book, which is pretty much my entire detailing of how the mind works. And that's always going to stick around, because that's kind of the basis for all of my thoughts, period. Yeah.
There's a transformation of the self, right? There's some kind of alchemy that goes on in producing a thing like this. So it has utility for the individual who's undergoing it, helps them super integrate all of their parts in a way. What kind of utility do you think coherent integrative meta theories and wholeness visions have in general? Why not just have a lot of different disciplines? Why is this potentially rewarding for the species to have?
I think it makes it easier to actually engage with the world in a more immediate way. I think that's the easiest way to put it. It is important to have a bunch of different disciplines, because everyone is going to be drawn to very particular and hyper-specific things in the world, and that's seemingly only ever going to increase and accelerate over time. But being able to have a ground to stand on in order to go forward into these new avenues, that is always going to be helpful. Yeah. It makes a greater context, really.
When I was a kid, I used to call myself a realization junkie. And a lot of the people I've spoken to who do something like meta theory or transdisciplinary thinking describe it a bit like a spiritual practice whereby they have and then work with these epiphany like moments where they discover like shapes of understanding that seem over pregnant with meaningfulness and could be endlessly unpacked. Um, does that ring true? And if so, what's it like for you to have moments of seeing, moments of realizing these structures?
Hmm. It is hard to say that I feel strong resonance there, but in terms of seeing things like that, I don't know. I can only say that moments like this just kind of strike me, and I just go into them. I can't say too much more in that sense. Yeah.
I like the strike makes me think of a passage in Nietzsche where he says the philosopher is the person who's struck by their ideas as if from without.
Yeah, big time. Yeah, that is absolutely what happens in the most general sense, or even broadest sense imaginable. Yeah.
Um,
Speaking of Nietzsche, that is also someone that has inspired me to.
yeah.
Yeah.
For me, there's moments like that of like, oh, like the amazingness of seeing structure, but there's also this process where it starts with frustration that I encounter a philosophical sentiment or a scientific form of mapping. I'm attracted to it, but something puts me off. So I research a little more. And if I keep getting agitated in the same way, then I try to draw or articulate the shape of my agitation and how it corrects the situation. And then I end up with something like a chunk or a step on my own path. Does that seem like something you
Yeah,
go through?
absolutely. Yeah, when Metaforma started, I was very agitated, highly frustrated with how things just appear information wise and why they're not more cohesive. When generally the frustration is mostly, I wouldn't say self created, it's very real and it kind of happens on account of being where you are in a culture or society. But yeah, it's strictly personal because no one else really shares it in quite the same way as you do. Yeah.
I have a lot of curiosity around whether the structures of meta level understanding are there or not, right? I encounter them sometimes like they inhabit an imaginal ecosystem. Ken Wilber has this phrase, vision, logic, space. Like maybe affective logic is a better term, but it is an interesting idea that there's a kind of patterning realm that people have been dipping into over history. Do you have that sense, like as if there's a space that's being explored here?
Yeah, I would say so. In terms of these patterns being there or not, yeah, I would say they definitely are. And recently I've been taking I don't know really what to call it. There's not much of a name for it. Like I can see it as something of a materialist sense in that they do exist in that sort of way, but it's like I feel like I'm taking it to a whole other level to in terms of how real they are. It's like, yeah, you actively engage with them and they are there in the world and they kind of emerge in the world on account of how the world is generally patterned. And I guess more of what I can say about that is the world is something like or at least now I'm seeing it as a thing that is constantly being sorted in general. It's something like a sorting process, and that sort of process just kind of naturally makes all of these patterns just kind of organize in very particular ways. And the sorting process is very simple and basic. And the elements that makes the world are also very granular, but also highly basic. And so it's like all of these things are just kind of emerging together and well, not emerging together, converging together and binding very minute ways, but they're doing it in such great scale and in such great magnitude that it's making very particular patterns. Yeah, yeah, that's absolutely real to me.
I guess there's a number of different ways of trying to say what these types of patterns are. I've been using the phrase metathemes, which just means things you find in metaspace. But I imagine them as kind of having something like a Mobius structure, where each one is like a fundamental facet of phenomenology that's a complex gradient of adjacency between two polarities that transform into each other and can't be thought apart from each other. So like one way is like order and chaos. You can't actually have one without the other. Ken Wilber and other people, you can't really have subjective and objective apart. Ontology and epistemology are deeply entangled in Hegel, and even like Heisenberg's indeterminacy principle, right? Position and momentum are somehow the same object. So that's one way I approach it. What's your feeling about like what are these things? Like what's this class of sense-making structures that we're working with here?
If we're talking particular structures, right now I'm kind of again focusing on the concept of these granular things that are just kind of molding together, right? And I think that it's just they could be considered points, but the points in Metaforma are like infinite, and they are just infinitely close together, which kind of goes nowhere. But these are finite points now. I call them masses, and there are two types of masses. One is positive, one is negative, and that's really all you need. And they just kind of, ideally, the positive and negative ones would go together. But positive and positive could also go together because I classify positive as just something that kind of just constantly draws things in and makes itself substantial in its own way. And negative is constantly just thrusting itself out and doesn't have any actual weight. That could be considered an emptiness of sorts. But you know, if you put positive and positive together, they'll just draw each other in and just kind of lash together. But the ideal is, of course, positive and negative because they can just feed into each other back and forth, and it would be very, very nice. And negative and negative can't go together because they just kind of repel each other and they always stay away. So treating those things as the basic elements and the sorting mechanism as literally just the forces themselves, just either repelling or attracting, it's it makes plenty of combinations. And I don't think there's too much more to work with outside of the cyclical nature of how all of this is repeating. It's like that's just generally how you have duration and time and the passage and becoming in general. Yeah.
So I got to know you through my colleague Corey, who's the driving force behind ARC and the archdisciplinarity movement, whose goals are, on the one hand, to support and encourage metatheorists to be able to do their work, but also to work with a mapping approach that takes as its objects the links or common pattern structures found across and between transdisciplinary integrative models. Is that a good idea? And how did you get involved with ARC or Corey?
So I'm going to hold on to the "is it a good idea" thing, and then introduce, try to go into how we were introduced. Yeah, someone in a community that I'm in spontaneously shared a link to ARC, and I was kind of curious about it, so I just kind of went into the website and I kind of had a look around. It's like, okay, this is a new thing that I haven't seen before. I didn't know things like this really existed. Sure enough, and there it is. I was looking around and I did find this table of all of the people that they've considered to be meta theories or what have you, and I noticed that Metaforma was there at like the bottom of the list as unknown author. I was like, oh, interesting. So they were also around in the communities I'm circulating in, huh? How very curious. So I was like, you know what? I can correct this. I'm not. It's not an unknown author. I'm right here. So I just reached out to the people at ARC, and Corey responded. I was like, hey. I'm the unknown author of Metaforma. You can go change this, and this. And then I had a few other questions because I was looking into what arc disciplinary thought actually was, because I had a general sense of what they were talking about, but I just wanted to be sure. And from there, Corey and I started talking because he was also seemingly, apparently, very interested in Metaforma. So I was like, okay, so you've looked into this, and it seems as though you shared it with a couple of others too. So I was like, okay, cool, awesome. So we had a chat about that, and he referenced you and a couple of other people, and yeah, that's kind of how we're talking now. And as for whether arc disciplinary thought is a good idea, I cannot say that I'm the person to ask for that, but it's an interesting one, and I think it's one that's going to happen anyway. It does make me think that these cultural stages are going to be increasingly just made intentionally as opposed to being classified and discovered, which I find very curious too.
Yeah, that's intriguing because it seems like that is parallel to what's going to happen with biological forms and species, right? We've been inheriting them, and they've gone through phases of development, but now we're in a position to start making up new ones and sending them in all kinds of directions. So our thought may be doing something similar at this point in history.
Yeah, big time. Absolutely. It's not uncommon to start making your own philosophies, especially nowadays, and it makes perfect sense to start making brand new cultural stages as one deems fit, you know. And I guess the individual can embody those as they see fit too, and that's going to lead to an interesting sort of plurality going into the future. Yeah.
This is a question actually I thought of earlier, which is you were mentioning sort of, this process of reaching out and getting involved in philosophical communities, and you get feedback, and it can enrich ideas and change the emphasis that you have on your ideas. So that seems on the one hand like a very productive process. Do you feel like there's any risk of it sort of undermining the intensity of your own approach, or undermining the sort of artistic purity of putting something like Metaforma together? Like, are there risks of watering it down in community?
Yeah, I would say so. Usually, when people make things like this, they tend to not allow other people to breach too much into their own ideas, which is perfectly understandable. It's like they definitely want to do it themselves because it is, of course, their own context to the world and not anyone else's. And of course, from their own creation, they can find ways to how other people are also engaging with this world in relation to themselves too. But yeah, when it comes to sharing your thoughts in public discourse and the like, it is very one is very careful as to what they say or how they approach this the topic at hand or whatever they wish to have improved or discussed about. Yeah, when I was doing it, I was just very tentatively testing out if a very particular word works or if a very certain line of thought works, and I just kind of left everything else just to myself. And that's generally how I approach it now, or whenever I do engage in discourse. I usually just go around questioning people's methods, and I kind of just leave it at that. I tend to not really go into my own thoughts unless people ask specifically. Yeah.
Yeah, there's a lot of lurking in these spaces because there's just
Oh
not
yeah.
room in social exchange to bring in most of anybody's huge organizations.
Yeah. That's an interesting conundrum. Everyone's in their
Um,
own world now. Yep.
One of the most debated or contentious issues in meta theory is the notion of developmental stages and layers. So, on the one hand, there's all these organic structural hierarchies of emergence and unfoldment in nature. On the other hand, social hierarchies, which presume to be competence based but are often unnecessary, corrupt, or ideologically distorted. We've got all these interesting models of development that come out of things like the maturation of cognitive stages or statistically tracking people's values and worldviews. And then there's all these other people who say that's only one misleading line of development. Thinking that way leads to genocide. And anyway, it's not very useful because to help people, you've got to deal with them where they're at and not impose some kind of arbitrary hierarchical architecture on them. How do you think about development in general?
When I was working on Metaforma, I considered putting in a development section in there, somewhere in the two-third part of the book, but I realized that that was very hard to do because it's hard to actually track what an individual or how an individual develops because they all have entirely different contexts and entirely different sets of information too, and they will all get entirely different sets of information. So I couldn't really do it, and I felt kind of pressured for time because I also wanted the book to be done. But I just when it comes to development in general, I now see it as it's kind of an ongoing process naturally, of course, but the individual can be said to have a something of a gap to fill, a very particular shape or a puzzle piece that needs to be slotted in. And when it is slotted in, they immediately just to mobilize into something entirely different and new. And this sort of hypothetical puzzle piece is entirely different for every single individual. And there is a seemingly never-ending abyss to really fill there. But yeah, it's about slotting in the right blocks at the exact right time. Otherwise, it's just not ever going to meld together or mesh together for them to mobilize in any sort of transformative way. They'll just kind of they'll understand it, they'll get it, but they won't really live the whole sequence of development. Yeah.
Yeah, well, that's definitely what we see with kids development. Like you've got a window for language.
Oh
you
yeah.
don't get it in that window. You can still get some of the functions, but you don't really become a linguistic person unless you get it in that window.
Yep.
What are you working on now? What's upcoming for Branden Singularity?
Right now I'm defining a new beginning for Metaforma. I've tossed out the whole beginning and now I'm just kind of starting over there, but everything else is just mostly intact with slight updates. I'm not going to be publishing anything new. I don't really have the desire to do any of that at the moment. Who knows, it might change, it might not. But at the moment that's kind of what I'm working on. Otherwise I'm just socializing, reaching out to people and seeing where I can help.
What's you say you're working on a new beginning for Metaforma. What's the crux of the change that you want to make to the existing beginning?
Well, I would say that spirals are out. No more of that. That was very hard to imagine, to be honest. I want something that is easy for me to conceive of particular images whenever I need to, as opposed to trying to render the entire, like just a whole bunch of lines intersecting and crossing together into complex forms. I don't want to do that anymore. It's very taxing. But that is that's more or less the crux. No more spirals. Working with fields as opposed to just I guess Euclidean geometry, basic lines and basic shapes. Just yeah, working with fields and how they move and the turbulence that they're in. Yep.
Spirals are out, fields are in.
And fields are in
because there's so much. Like spirals are such an attractive form because you're like, well, I do need some way to describe cycles, but that also change.
Yep.
And yeah, exactly. once you go past the first step of spirals, it just becomes like a maze of like, how do I track this or communicate with this in any way that isn't just vaguely inspirational to people?
Exactly. Yep.
I'd like a t-shirt that says spirals are out. That would be a good slogan.
No more spirals. No more spiraling. We're out of that now, okay?
I've been asking a lot of questions. What would you ask you?
I am currently plagued with the question of what exactly is beyond us, really. And that is something I've been settling as well, based on how I've been starting this new beginning of sorts, or making this new beginning. It's working with fields is a very interesting thing, because a field, one could say, is infinite, right? But we're obviously existing in a sort of finite context, but one would have to say that, well, if there's something finite, then doesn't that not necessarily mean that there's something infinite? Because, you just have you just stack finitudes on top of each other, and you just keep going on and on and on, and you can just do that forever. But that just leads to infinity, right? But okay, so if the field is hypothetically infinity, then how did that happen? How do you make a field? And that's something that's been plaguing me last week, really. But I just came up with the answer of well, a field just has to be what it is, and it has to be in a very particular order. And if you imagine like a 3D coordinate grid, you'll have a whole bunch of very particular delineations about where everything is, coordinates, and well, you can't really make that. It just kind of snaps into being, right? And I now think that it's like, well, every single coordinate, if you were to treat every single coordinate in totality as the field itself, and not just, this vague space of whatever it is, if you just treat that as the field, then it's like, okay, so how do these coordinates move and interact with each other? Well, they would have to, if I coincide or go along with the concept of sorting and everything being sorted, then how would they be sorted? Then it would be like well, there has to be a rule for how things are sorted. And I made up some sort of arbitrary rule to make that happen, and it feels correct, and it's smooth and easy to imagine things happening in that field, which is very important for me, because, as I said, I don't want to imagine spirals anymore. And yeah, it's the method of sorting that I came up with was an interesting thing. It was the final conclusion was that every single area, every single coordinate had to have, or has to have, a very particular assignment in order to be sorted. And because of how the field has to be, there is no particular way it has to be ordered. So it's like you have to have every single combination possible everywhere. And the way that it's assigned is, again, arbitrary, and most importantly, random. You just can't seemingly, or at least I can't seemingly, get around that. So I just went, okay, so if randomness is the floor of the world, then what's above randomness? And the answer is that there isn't much of an answer. It's just entirely arbitrary. And I didn't really like that answer too much. It's like, okay, well, everything's arbitrary. Well, what do I do? So now I'm just kind of settling on the concept of, well, not necessarily the absurd, because I also reject that idea. It's not necessarily absurd. It's comprehensible. It's, I just call it the weird instead. Because that kind of elicits a supernatural effect, but also something entirely irrational and strange and bizarre. Yeah, that's kind of where I'm at right now, in terms of a new beginning.
Yeah, pretty rational or a rational thing outside of the full set of the fields of all the different ways that things could be patterned.
Yep.
I'm paying a lot of attention to guys like Stephen Wolfram, who are kind of call the difference between order and randomness into question.
Yeah.
Like, if by random I only mean it's a completely structured system that my kind of a system can never reduce to something simple, okay, then yeah, it's random. But yeah, what's the what is order that behaves exactly like randomness, and how do we relate to that?
Right.
And What does it mean to think that computational engines might be able to explore that space in ways that don't make sense to us? Right? Like this is the Wolfram thing of like, so there's a limit on the ability of any complex system to reduce any other complex system. So at some point, most of the possible patterns are going to be patterns that you can't recognize as patterned, even if they are. But what happens if you make a tool that detects them as patterned and can tell you the results, but can't tell you why because you can't perceive the patterning? Then what kind of society are we in?
Exactly.
It's like
nonsense.
that's why the shamans returned.
Exactly.
Fields makes me think, obviously, quantum field theory. How much attention do you pay to reasonably recent or emerging models of physics?
Yeah, I would say I think it was last month. Yeah, I was already just kind of in the midst of trying to toss the beginning of Metaforma out in order to make something new, and yeah, that's during that week or two period. That's when quantum field theory actually clicked for me. I was like, oh, that's why there are multiple fields. I see. That's how they can just assemble and make interesting things. Okay, cool. But something within me is like something within me does not like the notion of having multiple fields. It seems entirely unnecessary to me. But maybe it's perfectly necessary within the confines of experimentation and the like, because that's a very important context for them and the like. But that's not particularly applicable to me right now. I'm in a whole other context. So yeah, no, there's something within me that doesn't like the notion of having a seemingly infinite number of fields, because it just seems like, well, you could just make a field for anything, really, whenever you need it. It seems kind of convenient to just do that, and I don't find that to be very acceptable. So I just I just go, yeah, there's only one field, and it's this one. So how does that move? How does that appear to move anyway?
What just popped up for me was a question. I'd love to hear how you think about it. Like
Sure.
some kind of functional threshold between the full extent of a field, which may as well be called infinite, and where there's significant effects of the field. Like if I've got a magnet, like okay, that magnet has I can register some value for that magnet at any point. Okay, but really it only pulls on things functionally within a much smaller zone. How do you think of the distinction being made between the full extent of a field and the much smaller subsection of a field where it seems like it actually engages with things?
Yeah, that to me is the difference between the infinite and the finite. Because of how the finite is, I do think that there has to be a smallest magnitude in which things can interact, and in within the confines of this sorting idea, it's like things can only sort in a very particular perimeter or area in a limited number of ways, because once a thing is sorted and all of the combinations are run through, they'll just they'll just cease and stop, and that's probably how you get something of a form or a body of some kind, because it's not going to do anything else. And of course the surrounding area around that field is just gonna around that mass is just gonna kind of whirl around and interact with it in weird and different ways, and the whole thing will probably just kind of change in very small ways. But ultimately, it's like that. There is a very particular limit to how things rather there has to be a limit in order for things to interact in that sort of way. So that every single area has its own, general context, which is seemingly a word that I like today. But context is very important, and especially in where we are in the sense of the infinite field. Yeah.
Oh, the God question. Is there any utility in conceiving of the weird in a second person relationship?
Second person.
I guess
Describe second.
as if it was, as if it was a person or a sentience or an entity. Is that useful? Is there validity to that, or is that a distorting interpretation?
It's I would say useful and interesting. It's right now it's if I were to see the weird as something of a person or a deity, if you will, it would be something that has defined instantaneously every single area in a field in this three-dimensional field. It basically made infinity, which is very interesting to consider, and it did it without any reason, without literally no process for reasoning. It did it instantaneously with no thought whatsoever. And I can't even say it did it on a whim. It just sort of happened, right? And if someone were to embody such behavior, it would be like, well, they just kind of go around doing whatever and they're not thinking about it. And that, of course, can be dangerous. But if placed in a very particular context, it could be good. It could be terrifying, mostly if you have that person around. You don't know what they're gonna do, which I find very funny. But yeah, the idea of this of everything that is happening in this world just being just happening, it just kind of makes me think that the in a kind of heretical sort of way, just saying, well, the logos is just, well, whatever, and that's what the word is. And there it is. It's yeah, it's interesting to consider it in that way. But yeah, decision
It's
making is the core of it.
comical to imagine a person behaving like that. And I haven't read this book, but I know there's a book that the actor Sean Penn wrote, and the title is Bob Honey Who Just Do Stuff. um, what else? Where is ecology in all of this? How do we
Ecology.
think about the natural world? Because that's really pertinent to everything the species is facing.
Yeah. In in terms of ecology, that's definitely, the finite context. It you can just describe that as a well, as they appear, with us being in a finite context and us being finite limited forms and everything else around us being very finite in their own sense. Yeah, it's about where you're looking at it, what you're focusing on. Personally, I know next to nothing about ecology. I can't really speak on ecology, period. But yeah, the people that are engaged with it, they are engaging with it in meaningful ways because that is indeed their that's where they are in this world. And it's important, I would say, to at the very least, well, I guess I can't really speak on that either. It's very personal, isn't it? It's very specific to the individual. I have no idea what they're doing, and I don't quite know how I would engage with it beyond what I'm doing right now.
Um, do you have hunches about what defines a living system, and maybe more specifically what defines a healthy, constructively interactive living system, as opposed to all the other variants?
Hmm. I would say that a healthy, interactive living system. Well, I think it would be something that is naturally just kind of, I wouldn't say feeding back into itself because that's kind of closed and perpetual and doesn't actually evolve if that's the case. So there has to be a constant influx of things coming in and things, of course, naturally being recycled or being reused, but allowing that whole system to move forward and actually change without actually destroying itself.
Um, Other than the meta theoretical work of constantly being on a self-correcting journey of understanding and the attempt to articulate understanding, what other sorts of inner practices do you work with?
I cannot say that I work with inner practices. The times that I've tried, deliberately meditating, I never really liked the state that it put me in, so I just kind of stopped doing it. I was talking to someone that greatly encouraged a very particular form of meditation of repeating a sequence of numbers and just kind of focusing on that and just kind of doing that over and over and over and getting faster and faster and faster at doing it. And I could do it without too much of an issue. The problem is, it's like it doesn't feel like it's doing anything for me. It's just kind of putting me in some sort of trance, and I don't really like that. So, no. In terms of what people describe as meditation, I just seemingly do that naturally. I kind of just zone out for periods at a time, not doing much of anything at all, and just kind of I'm not thinking anything. I'm just kind of being with myself. That's about as good as I can describe it. And I do think that some people are naturally inclined to do that anyway. It's just a matter of whether or not they are comfortable doing it, I suppose. If they're comfortable just sitting around and letting their thoughts be, as opposed to just constantly wanting to have some sort of activity happening to placate boredom or whatever, they'll that's a whole other rhythm that they can be in. But yeah, those are I guess that's my relationship with inner practices. I'm interested in trying to have a state where I can just continue doing general activities and just be completely still in my mind. I very much enjoy that far more. It's like an active meditation of sorts. Yeah, that's what I enjoy.
Are you paying much attention to the AI discussions, either in terms of how are these systems getting the results that they're getting in their pseudo-cognition, and also in terms of what's this going to do to the system we live in the short to midterm?
My engagement with it is kind of minimal, but I am getting a sense of where it is going. Since I am an artist, I first heard of the whole AI thing with generative art, and my immediate reflex, knee-jerk reaction was, this is going to be horrible for the human cognition. Like, no one's going to be able to imagine anything after a while, especially if people start depending on it. That's something that I was immediately worried about. Now I'm just like, I actually have no idea where this is going. It's definitely going to affect people's livelihoods. That much is a given. I guess if it becomes enough of a threat, it's going to be legislated, which is probably for the best. But you can't progress things too quickly because, of course, finite things cannot progress too quickly. Otherwise, they just kind of break or fall apart. Yep.
Yeah, the collapse of the imagination and now the degradation of our advanced cognitive faculties on a mass scale is worrying to me. And I think of both of those things happening simultaneously, with people even more mistrustful of all information than they are now. And that seems like a recipe for a very erratic population.
Yeah. I guess one thing I've also been noticing is how maybe I guess it's just my personal experience and all, but the desire to speak in general has been diminishing over time, and I find that curious. It's like people's ability to communicate is kind of just getting worse. Maybe it's just the circles that I'm in. I have no idea, but it's not looking too great.
Yeah, I think there's a small percentage of the population that might be getting better, but the majority seems to be letting a lot of the structures we've been using to do communication go. right? So the optimistic part of me is like, oh, they're returning, like we made a wrong turn and they're going back to a simpler place, maybe that's more visceral, more evocative, more Paleolithic or something. Okay, that could be good. On the other hand, we're losing a lot of nuance, we're losing a lot of skill, we're losing a lot of problem solving and sense making capacity. That's probably not good.
No. Yeah, you do bring up kind of returning back to a Paleolithic sort of sense. Yeah, I'm also getting the sense that as time progresses, because of how AI just kind of generates information in all forms, like media, text, etc., there's going to be an increasing distrust in what is online, and that'll probably push people offline, period, because it's just, there's no reason to be there anymore, except for just, just making things on a whim, which kind of correlates back to the weird. Maybe that's the thing that's trying to usher itself into the world, the concept of just arbitrary creation and designation of things in general, and just having it be there for no apparent reason at all. Yeah,
that sense of where can we turn to get experience that feels real and substantial if our entire sort of social digital infrastructure feels extremely mistrustful.
Gotta go somewhere.
Can be good because we should be offline more. On the other hand, isn't that kind of what the Nazis were doing, in the sense of, hey, modernity's not working for us, let's roll back to an ethnocentric theocratic model that at least feels solid. You're like, okay, you're probably going to get real bad turbulence from a move like that.
Yeah, it's I'm curious to see just exactly how things are going to go should such an exodus happen like that. Yeah.
Is there anything else we should talk about?
I'm always blank, man.
Good to hear.
Yeah.
I feel like maybe this is a good time to come to an end here. If anybody's made it this far, they've got a lot to think about. There's some very concise, dense, potent exchanges so far. I really appreciate you being here. And this is a great, it's just exciting to me to play in this kind of mind space. So I appreciate it.
Yeah, likewise.